and welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market. This is your guest co-host, Chris Opperman, and we are picking up our conversation with Dr. Mark Thornton. We're coming back to the theme of Baptists and bootleggers and what this means for marijuana and alcohol prohibition. So, Dr. Thornton, we ended the last segment talking a little bit about Portugal's experience, particularly when it comes to the distinction between decriminalization and total legalization. So I guess, can we pick up on that a little bit more? Can you kind of explain why Portugal is such a special case when we're talking about substance prohibition?
Yeah, the distinction between decriminalization and legalization is important. With decriminalization, basically people can produce, distribute, and consume illegal products such as marijuana, especially if they're done on a small scale. And the rules, however, are left on the books that ultimately make the production and distribution of these products technically illegal. And so you can technically be arrested, you might be thrown in jail, or you might be given a small monetary fine. And which is the case in California today. As a lead up to Proposition 19, they signed a decriminalization bill which basically put a small fine on marijuana consumers, but they could still go after and prosecute the big-time producers. In Portugal, for the last several years, they've decriminalized all drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and so forth, so that you can be arrested and you can be fined, but basically the punishment is to go in front of counselors who offer you ways of breaking your addiction to these certain products. Okay, so they have a decriminalization. It's not completely legalized, that things are not available for sale in regular stores. You can't go to Walmart and buy heroin in Portugal, for example. But what's happened in Portugal is that the drug problem in the country has actually diminished as a result of decriminalization. Everybody projected that drug use would have increased, drug addiction would have increased, but the results have been the exact opposite. So it's been a big success. It's been an important illustration. The rate of drug addiction has fallen. The rate of drug use has fallen. The spread of HIV through dirty needles and heroin has been reduced, and so it's been a tremendous gain.
How about crime? How has it affected crime in Portugal?
Crime has also decreased because there's a lot of crime associated with illegal markets, protecting your illegal markets, your territory, stealing money from drug dealers, shootouts between drug dealers, and so forth. And so decriminalization has taken away most of that lucrative profits, and as a result, violence and crime, the crime that drug addicts would do to finance their habits has declined. And so it's been a win-win proposition for Portugal, and it's a tremendous illustration to the entire world of what the benefits of liberty are and what the cost of prohibition are. Legalization, on the other hand, would make it perfectly legal to produce, distribute, and consume a particular product. And this is important because this would bring in corporate America, so to speak, into the picture, so that pharmaceutical companies, retail stores, pharmacies, and so forth would be back in the market to produce these drugs, which they used to be. Prior to Prohibition, things like heroin were legally available for sale. They were actually prescribed for little children even.
Actually, if I can add something really quick, I remember seeing a picture of an ad for heroin from, I think, 1905 or something like that. And, it was kind of the thing that you could just walk in and buy.
That's correct. And, the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company produced and sold that product. It was sold throughout the United States, and there was a few ailments that children and women had that doctors prescribed this product for. And it was actually a very beneficial product. It's a tremendous painkiller, and it could be useful today for all sorts of things, and it's just not available, and it should be available. And it would also, of course, break up the violence and crime associated with the illegal markets that we currently have. But if we look at legalization, what happens when you bring corporate America into the picture is that has even further benefits because, the bigger the corporations are, the safer they're going to want to make those products. And they're going to want to keep them out of the hands of minors, too, because they're liable. They're legally liable for the harm that the products would bring. And, of course, if you sold things to minors and they were harmed as a result of it, and they had an overdose of heroin, let's say, the company could be sued for millions and millions of dollars. And so corporate America, if they were in the business, they would be producing a very safe product, a very reliable product, one of uniform quality and purity, and also they wouldn't want to get them into the hands of minors because you're legally liable for damages. And in the case of minors, if you sold to minors, the liability is much, much greater. And so you bring corporate America into the picture, and all of a sudden you bring in more of society, more of the legal tradition, and people would be much safer consuming these drugs. In the illegal marketplace, there's no uniformity, there's no uniform potency or purity. There's all sorts of dangerous chemicals added to these drugs, and as a consequence, we see thousands of people dying each year as a result of illegal production.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. When we come back, folks, we're going to continue our conversation with Dr. Mark Thornton, but we're going to take a turn and talk about other examples than drugs and alcohol prohibition and how they are a Baptist bootlegger phenomenon. Please stay with us. We'll be right back. And welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm your host, Michael McKay. And my co-host, Chris Opperman, had a question that he wanted to develop now with Dr. Mark Thornton. Please go ahead, Chris.
So, Dr. Thornton, I think we've already talked a lot in detail about how the Bootleggers and Baptists framework works in the case of alcohol and marijuana prohibition. But I think it can also be extended to other examples from public policy and from government policy. I know that in his article on Bootleggers and Baptists, Yandel offers many examples, many stories like this. Can you tell us about some of these and how the same framework that applies to alcohol and marijuana applies to some of these other cases?
Absolutely, and it's really a fascinating area of really politics, but the economics of politics and how strange bedfellows come together, uniting in order to promote their shared interest. And I think probably one of the best examples that I'm aware of, and that Bruce goes into some detail, is in the case of oil production. For example, drilling oil in Alaska, which of course is a big political issue. And what we found is, oddly enough, is that the environmentalists, of course, are against drilling for oil in new areas of the Alaskan wilderness. And so you have the environmentalists on the one hand, but you also have the incumbent oil-producing companies also opposing this and actually donating money to the environmental groups so that they can oppose drilling for oil in northern Alaska in the wilderness. And the reason the oil companies want to help the environmentalists stop oil production is because these incumbent giant oil companies, they already have their wells drilled. They already have their sources of supply. And what they're worried about is two things. One is new competitors coming into the market as a result of opening up the Alaska wilderness to new oil drilling, and just the fact that even if they got the rights to drill, it would be more oil production coming online, and as a result, the price of their oil that's in the ground is going to fall. And so they're willing to fork over, say, a couple $1 million distributed to environmental groups so that the environmental groups can, spread the news and protest and do all these things to prevent the new oil drilling. And it doesn't look like the oil companies themselves are serving their own interest. They pay other people to serve their interest. And so you have the case of environmentalists and the incumbent oil companies opposing oil production and jacking up gasoline prices to you and me. And there's all sorts of examples of this, particularly environmentalism with like the Clean Air Act and things of that nature. And we also see another interesting case of unions and anarchists and anti-trade groups coming together, and where the unions provide money to the anarchists and the anti-trade people to go to these conferences on globalism, like with the G20, for example, and they pay the anarchists to protest and to raise all sorts of trouble. These left-wing guys, even causing violence, and so it's the unions who are paying for this disruption and all the publicity against globalism. But what they're really doing is they're not really interested in helping the anarchists themselves. They're interested in stopping free trade, but they don't want to come out themselves and say unions are against free trade because it's going to hurt their wages. So it's another example of two unlikely groups coming together to support legislation that would restrict our freedom and raise prices for everybody else in society.
And they're just paying someone else to do their dirty work for them, essentially.
Yes, they're paying somebody else to do the dirty work because, first of all, they don't want to do it, and second of all, they don't want to be obvious in the sense that, if you had union after union marching down the street protesting this, it would look rather obvious that they're doing it in their own selfish economic interest of preventing trade and preventing falling prices for all Americans. So what they were doing is just keeping their own individual wages up for unionized labor. So it's strange bedfellows.
And you mentioned a particular example of in the environmentalist movement with with oil drilling and things like that. And I think another example that kind of broadly comes to mind is the debate about global warming and restrictions on carbon production in global warming. And a lot of times you do see some of these companies sort of also kind of jumping on the bandwagon and, kind of trying to promote environmental responsibility and things like that. But to what extent are those actions a lot of times just another expression of this phenomenon?
Well, I think it's true that there's a lot of groups that see the benefits of global warming in the sense that if you can get restrictions on the economy put in place as a result of this so-called phenomenon of global warming. Personally, I like the idea of global warming, but there's a big political movement against it, and there's all sorts of interest groups who are paying to promote this movement against global warming or against climate change. The oil companies are involved. All sorts of companies throughout the economy see that they could benefit from those restrictions, even though it's going to hurt the average American. The incumbent firms in the effective industry are going to be getting the breaks or the allocations, the carbon allocations, for example, and as a result, they're going to benefit. They could trade off those allocations later on and make a lot of money for doing absolutely nothing. So we see incumbent firms throughout a lot of these industries seeing the benefits, but who's going to lose? Well, it's going to be potential entrants into those industries, new competitors, and of course the average American is going to end up paying more in their electric bill, more for gasoline, more for everything, and they're going to be forced to pay for insulating their homes and all sorts of other products that they're going to be required to buy, or at least they're going to be given incentives to purchase all these products. And so there's a lot of firms who have identified the fact that as incumbents that they'll be able to benefit from global warming legislation.
Well, I think one of the things, I'm going to jump in here for a second here, Chris.
Sure,
What's coming out here is what we have in previous shows brought out the idea that people really need to start thinking in terms of that second step of logic, which is actually a term I want to credit to Mr. Jeffrey Tucker, who's actually been on our show a few times and is one of the people that we consider very, very powerful intellectual force. He is the editor of Mises.org. And it's caused me to actually bring out the idea to people of getting into the habit of asking for the backstory. What is the backstory? Because the backstory is really the second step of logic. Why do these environmentalists and oil companies up in Alaska actually unite? What is their motivation to do so? And, going into the tradition of the literature that is available for people to study and get themselves educated on this, many economists, particularly those that ascribe to the Austrian, or as we like to call it, reality economics model, like to bring up this fundamental lesson of economics. And this was explored by Henry Hazlitt in Economics in One Lesson and Frederick Bastiat. And I'd like to actually ask this question of, to what extent does the prohibition policy reflect this tendency to only pay attention to the obvious and evident effects of prohibition, and at the same time completely ignore the hidden and unseen consequences of these policies?
Yeah, you're bringing up Bastiat's concept of the seen and the unseen. And I'd like to plug my Bastiat collection, a whole new set of English translations, which the Institute sells 2 hardback volumes for $44. It's also available in a free PDF on Mises.org. And in the very first page of this collection, you only have to read one page, and it, in a sense, makes you an economist, because it says you have to go beyond what is seen into the unseen in order to understand the completeness of any particular policy or institution. And I think there's no better example of this than in the case of prohibition, because what most people see with, like, illegal drugs, for example, is that they see addiction, they see overdose, they see people run down, they see violence, they see decaying inner cities, they see all sorts of negative things, and they associate it with drug use. However, what actually is going on here is that it's not drug use per se that are causing all these social problems, but almost all of the social problems are actually caused by drug prohibition. Not drug use per se, but drug prohibition, because drug prohibition, of course, makes it illegal, drives up the price, forces production into the underground black market economy, resulting in all sorts of crime and violence beyond the actual production, distribution, and sale of these drugs, but also the unintended crime, which is related to the illegal drug business. And so you get all sorts of political corruption, you get a lot of street crime, you get a lot of violence, you get street gangs, for example. Where do street gangs come from? Well, they come from the illegal drug business. They come from the prohibition itself. We didn't really have street gangs until alcohol was made illegal nationwide back in 1920, and we've had them ever since, because we've always had some prohibition, which is generating huge amounts of revenue and providing the monetary economic basis for these street gangs. And people don't realize that, because they never go beyond the seen to the unseen, to the backstory, to that second step of logic. And once they do, once they see that all of these negative consequences are actually the result of prohibition, then they change their mind entirely with regard to the policy after thinking about it. And there's a great Simpsons episode called Homer versus the 18th Amendment, which in 21 minutes actually demonstrates exactly how prohibition results in all of these, bad products, dangerous products, crime, corruption, the whole 9 yards. It's explained there by the writers of The Simpsons. So you can take this lesson that we're talking about today and bring it to your friends.
Excellent.
Your friends and your relatives and everybody, because people aren't. It's really hard to get people to sit down and read 2 volumes of Bastiat, but it's not very hard to get your friends to sit down and watch a 21-minute episode of The Simpsons.
So, Chris, go ahead. You had a question about how economics is a very useful tool.
Exactly. So I guess dovetailing on the comments you just made, I think especially with this idea of the unseen and the seen, we see that economics can be a counterintuitive tool, right? It leads us to sort of counterintuitive conclusions about the world, that raising minimum wages may not actually help poor people, that prohibiting drugs may not actually be the best idea. So I guess one of the things you can use economics for is to maybe flip the Baptist case for prohibition on its head. Because I think the Baptist case against prohibition rests on the idea that the way to reduce drug use is to make drugs illegal. And that's the way we should go about to make sure that this problem goes away. But to what extent does drug prohibition actually help reduce drug use? Doesn't it make it more dangerous for addicts to seek treatment? And aren't there also quality control problems that arise and make it more dangerous for people who venture into the illegal market?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's no question about that. The Baptists are, a prime case of seeing or just seeing the seen and not seeing the unseen. So they see, for example, alcohol is creating all these problems, when in fact that's really not the case. And so they promote prohibition on that basis, that if they can just take away the product, that you'll wipe out sin and you'll wipe out all these socially undesirable aspects that are seen to be related to the drugs or to the alcohol. And so they're a prime example of all this. And you really need, that this basic economic understanding of the seen and the unseen, things like supply and demand, to understand what impact you're actually having. And in terms of, the extended effects of prohibition, it really does defeat the general thrust of what the Baptists had hoped to obtain. They wanted people to be temperate in their alcohol consumption, and so they used moral suasion to try to achieve that. And in fact, they did achieve that. People listened to sermons, they listened to medical advice, and they said, it's probably a good thing to cut back on consumption of alcohol. And so they were achieving some success, but they couldn't achieve perfect success. So they put down the Bible and they went to the voting booth in order to totally wipe alcohol and drug consumption out.
Yeah, I was actually studying some things about how back in the early 1800s they were quite active with their proselytizing on this issue, and progressively throughout the 1800s they became much more alarmed because of significantly Catholic and Lutheran immigrants into the United States who would have, for example, beer gardens after their Sunday services, which they thought was an anathema, and so they sought to actually have that prohibited, which is, as I understand it, the real source. And please comment and correct me if I'm incorrect, of why Sunday was a dry day and made so a dry day, and still is in many places throughout the country. Is that true?
Yes, that is true. That the Baptists were responsible for promoting blue laws, which kept most establishments closed on Sunday, and particularly alcohol establishments. So you couldn't sell beer, wine, or booze in the grocery store or in the liquor store or in the wine store. I think what was really going on there is that the Baptists did oppose this drinking on Sunday, but they also viewed it as a competitive threat. Just think of it, if a religion imposes hardships and restrictions on you, whereas other religions don't impose those same restrictions and hardships, then they become competitors of yours. And as a result, the Baptists didn't want to compete on that level. And they also, of course, didn't want people drinking, and so they were the big promoters of, trying to squash this new competitor that was arriving from Europe in large numbers and having a transformative effect on societies in urban areas, basically.
Well, when we come back, folks, into our final segment, we'll get from Dr. Thornton a few comments on repealing prohibition and what the practical steps of that might be. And so please stay with us. This is Michael McKay in Radio Free Market, and I'm talking with Dr. Mark Thornton, and we are going to be back in just a minute. So please stay with us. Welcome back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market, and I'm going to hand this right over to you, Chris, so that we can get as much in this final segment. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, Dr. Thornton, as we discussed, in the case of Prop 19, it didn't enjoy a lot of support among politicians. But as you've written, though, in a historical example, prohibition was a popular thing with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he actually pushed Congress and the states to repeal the 18th Amendment, and it was an act that made him extremely popular during his time in office. And it's one of the things, a few instances in which Roosevelt actually expanded liberty. So I guess my question for you is, using this interesting example, why does something similar not happen with prohibition today?
Well, it's a very good question. FDR, as one of his very first acts as president, right after being inaugurated, pushed Congress to repeal prohibition, and he signed a law legalizing beer, and he instantly became the most popular person in that generation's history. Historians say it was all the New Deal things he did, but in reality, he changed America for the better with the signing of his pen. Now, the reason, of course, he was so popular is because alcohol was a widely consumed product back then, whereas most illegal drugs are not consumed by a lot of people. It's only marijuana where the prospects are good, because we have an entire generation today that knows that marijuana consumption is not the dangerous product that the federal officials tell us. As a matter of fact, there's a book called Marijuana is Safer, which makes the case that marijuana is a much safer drug than alcohol. And so I think the door is opening towards marijuana legalization, and once that door opens, as I mentioned earlier, I think we could see a floodgate open for more liberty and less government. And so that's what I'm hoping for. It's basically just a matter of the numbers. And now we've gotten to the point where an entire generation is seeing the fact that the federal prohibition is really a lie. It's a non-truth. And so ultimately, I think the prospects for liberty and the prospects for repeal are going to happen. We've seen medical marijuana pass. We've seen medical marijuana decriminalization pass. And legalization is the next step in California, then the nation, and then the world.
So let's talk about those action steps, because I'd like you to flesh out a little bit more in the final seconds that we have. Any ways that we can change the public perception of the drug war so that lawmakers will feel pressure to do away with these destructive and counterproductive policies?
Well, there's so many things that it's really hard to summarize them, but the biggest point is money. Drug prohibition is costing us money as taxpayers in so many ways. It's diverting our law enforcement away from real crimes. It's diverting our judicial system away from real crimes, and it's diverting our prisons, which are completely overpacked. We have the world's largest prison population in the history of mankind, and these are all expensive things. Not only are we not getting justice for real crimes, but we're spending tons and tons of money, and it's hurting the budget. And so what happened back in alcohol prohibition is that the budget was also hurting. We were in an economic crisis, and they needed the money. Alcohol was the second largest source of government revenue before it was prohibited. If they didn't have the income tax, they could have never prohibited alcohol. So we need to go after on the money issue and the fact that drugs like marijuana are actually safer than alcohol, and if we put them in the marketplace, they would be even safer than they are in the illegal marketplace. And so in so many ways, but primarily the fiscal question that is costing America tons of money to try to enforce the stupid, ridiculous, anti-rational law onto the American public. Okay,
Mark, I'm going to have to cut you off, and I want to thank you very much for being with us today, and also my co-host, Mr. Christopher Opperman, and this is Michael McKay in Radio Free Market. Please visit us on the web at radiofreemarket.com, where you can subscribe for free to all of our shows on iTunes, or visit our Radio Free Market archives for easy downloads. And until next week, folks, wherever you are, please stand up for freedom. Thank you for listening.